HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents To the Promised Land, Martin Luther King and the Fight for Economic Justice, by Michael K. Honey, read by J.D. Jackson. I never intend to adjust myself to the evils of segregation and the crippling effects of discrimination. I never intend to adjust myself to the tragic inequalities of an economic system which takes necessities from the masses to give luxuries to the classes. I never intend to become adjusted to the madness of militarism and the self-defeating method of physical violence. I call upon you to be maladjusted. King at Highlander Folk School, September 2nd, 1957. Whether it be the ultra-right wing in the form of Birch societies, or the alliance which former President Eisenhower denounced, the alliance between big military and big business, or the coalition of Southern Dixiecrats and Northern reactionaries, whatever the form, these menaces now threaten everything decent and fair in American life. As we struggle to make racial and economic justice a reality, let us maintain faith in the future. At times we confront difficult and frustrating moments in the struggle to make justice a reality, but we must believe somehow that these problems can be solved. King at the AFL-CIO Convention, December 3rd, 1961. You are reminding not only Memphis, but you are reminding the nation that it is a crime for people to live in this rich nation and receive starvation wages. King at Memphis Sanitation Strike Rally, March 18th, 1968. Introduction. Promised Land. Be concerned about your brother. You may not be on strike, but either we go up together or we go down together. Martin Luther King, Jr., April 3rd, 1968, Memphis. On April 3rd, 1968, Martin Luther King, Jr. swayed at the pulpit in a late-night gathering at Mason Temple in Memphis, Tennessee. At age 39, King sometimes looked like an older man, tired, worn, and discouraged. Exhausted from constant travel, often making 4 or 5 speeches a day and sleeping only a few hours per night, King had a sore throat and slight fever. His companion, Reverend Ralph David Abernathy, said King had those symptoms whenever he felt premonitions of death. Thunder and lightning rent the air, and when a ceiling fan made a banging sound, it startled King as if it were a rifle shot. Memphis that night experienced one of the drenching downpours that regularly swept through the Mississippi Delta, as a storm outside turned into a tornado that wreaked havoc on neighboring towns and killed several people. King had at first stayed in his hotel, but when told that the news media and hundreds of his supporters demanded his presence, he had made his way to the temple through a driving rain. King and his organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, had fought since 1957 to redeem the soul of America by seeking equality before the law, integration, and voting rights for all. The country's adoption of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 had completed a first phase of the freedom movement, King said. Now he wanted a second phase struggle for economic equality, so that everyone could have a well-paying job or a basic level of income, along with decent levels of health care, education, and housing. Along with the A. Philip Randolph Institute, King had promoted a detailed document called An Economic Bill of Rights for All Americans. Before coming to Memphis, he had been crisscrossing the country for weeks, promoting a multiracial coalition to pressure Congress to reallocate money for war to money for human needs. King called it the Poor People's Campaign, a last-ditch effort to save America from the interrelated evils of racism, poverty, and war. Urban rebellions of the last 4 summers and the wanton destruction of human life and waste of America's economic resources in the escalating Vietnam War, he feared, would lead to escalating racism and repressive authoritarian government. Time magazine in 1957 had declared him no radical, but America's segregationists and right-wing saw King as just that. Federal Bureau of Investigation FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover publicly called him a liar in 1964, and in March 1967 ordered a counterintelligence COINTELPRO campaign by his field agents to prevent the rise of a black messiah, and redoubled efforts to counteract King. From the 1963 March on Washington onward, Hoover's agents followed King, wiretapped his office, his hotel rooms, his house. They even sent an anonymous letter that urged King to take his own life or else have his private life exposed. Hoover's FBI leaked fake news and distorted reports to journalists, Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, the heads of all major departments of government, the military, and the CIA. FBI secret agents paid agents provocateurs to stir up dissension and conflict among King's followers and within the Black Power and New Left movements. Southern segregationists and the ultra-right John Birch Society sent out pamphlets and postcards and mounted billboards on Southern highways claiming to picture King at a communist training school. In fact, a picture of King and Rosa Parks and Miles Horton at the non-sectarian Highlander Folk School, the one institution in the South where blacks and whites were encouraged to frankly discuss issues. A right-wing campaign by neo-Nazis and pro-military anti-communist groups painted the famous Baptist preacher as communist. By 1968, King had suffered a bombing of his home and his hotel room, body blows by a neo-Nazi in the South, stoning by whites armed with baseball bats wanting to kill him in a suburb of Chicago, a raucous anti-communist shoutdown in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, largely due to his stand against the Vietnam War. Death threats plagued King and his family. Some saw him as a dangerous radical troublemaker. Others thought King wasn't radical or militant enough. King's philosophy of love and nonviolence looked like old-fashioned sentimentalism unsuited to violent American realities. H. Rap Brown of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, said, "Violence is as American as cherry pie." And it was true. Most Americans did not understand nonviolence as a philosophy or strategy for social change. Many in the business and political classes also opposed King's strong support for unions as a way to obtain a greater degree of racial and economic justice. Although today many have come to see King as an icon for American values, in his own time he was often reviled, physically attacked, and dismissed as a false prophet. In 1968, he was struggling to survive. Yet to most African Americans, and certainly to his audience in Memphis, King offered extraordinary inspiration, dedication, book learning, and gifts of oratory. On this evening in Bishop Mason Temple of the Church of God in Christ, hundreds of striking black sanitation workers, their families, and community activists knew King understood the plight of the working poor. They were now in the 6th week of a desperate struggle, and King came to support them in their efforts to raise their families above the poverty level through unionization. In December 1964, after receiving the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo, Norway, King had returned to his hometown of Atlanta to join picket lines and declare an economic boycott to support some 600 black women on strike, declaring, "We have decided that now is the time to closely identify our movement very closely with labor." King told a reporter, many more alliances between civil rights and labor movements would follow. Memphis became one of those efforts, along with his dozens of speeches to union rallies, picket lines, and conventions in the years to come. Some in his audience in Mason Temple thought King looked exhausted, but he soon proved otherwise. Speaking without notes, he started quietly, slowly. King imagined himself moving from the beginning of time to have a panoramic view of the whole of human history up to now. He took his audience back to the struggles against slavery in Egypt and Greece, back to the Civil War and slave emancipation, and to President Franklin D. Roosevelt's vow that we have nothing to fear but fear itself during the Great Depression. King described the past as a mighty movement for human freedom. But he said if the Almighty asked him when he would most want to live, he would answer, "If you allow me to live just a few years in the second half of the 20th century, I will be happy." Why? In 1968, he lived in a climate of left-right political polarization, white racial backlash, and massive carnage by and against the U.S. military in Indochina. He admitted, "The world is all messed up. The nation is sick. Trouble is in the land. Confusion all around." Yet he saw 1968 as a time of great social change. His voice rising, King cried out, "Something is happening in Memphis. Something is happening in our world." From South Africa to Memphis, the masses of people are rising up, and their demand is always the same. We want to be free. Humanity's difficulties had accumulated, so that all problems had to be solved together, creating an opportunity for what King called the human rights revolution. King had only been to Memphis a few times, yet he seemed to know his audience and their issues well. Conditions in Memphis exemplified the country's failure to move beyond civil rights to economic justice. African Americans, many of them recent migrants from the collapsing cotton economy, suffered from high unemployment, low wages, and soaring poverty. Perhaps half of the population of young black men had no jobs at all. Of those who had jobs, some 80% of black women worked in the homes of whites, with no labor law protections, and 80% of employed black men did unskilled labor. For black women and men in factory, service, laboring, or municipal jobs, a union provided their only hope for a better life. The conditions of Memphis sanitation workers exemplified the plight of the working poor. They suffered from low wages, abuse by white supervisors, unsafe conditions, and systemic poverty. Through their union organizing, they protested being dismissed from work by white supervisors for the slightest infraction, being forced to carry leaking garbage tubs on their heads, eating their lunches in the shade of the garbage truck, being hurt and even killed on the job, reeking of garbage when they came home because they had no access to washing facilities. They sought an end to wages so low that men worked full-time, but their families lived in poverty. The all-male group demanded union recognition, collective bargaining rights, and deduction of union dues from their paychecks to make it possible to pay for a union staff person to represent them and operate a union effectively. Getting the city of Memphis to recognize their right to belong to a union with collective bargaining rights became the single most important point of conflict and gave rise to the worker slogan, "I am a man." Some 1,300 workers had endured 6 weeks of unemployment, hunger, and foreclosures on cars and homes. White police had attacked strikers, ministers, and civil rights activists with tear gas, the chemical mace, and clubs. The police and FBI had infiltrated the ranks. The mayor had hired strikebreakers and threatened to fire strikers. The black community, women and men alike, understood and rallied behind their "I am a man" picket signs as a cry for recognition of their union and their human dignity. Some saw the strike of garbage and street and sewer workers as a small story, but as he had done during the Montgomery bus boycott 13 years earlier, King elevated it as part of an epical movement for human freedom. "We mean business now, and we are determined to gain our rightful place in God's world," he said, to shouts of affirmation. "We are saying that we are determined to be men. We are determined to be people. We are saying that we are God's children, and we don't have to live like we are forced to live." In good Baptist preacher style, he speeded up his cadence and intensity as the audience response gave him power and energy. King's staff had strongly opposed going to Memphis. Sanitation worker Taylor Rogers recalled, "He was planning this big march to Washington. All his staff thought it was outrageous of him to stop and come to Memphis. But he went where he was needed, where he could help poor people. That's why he dropped everything, regardless of what all his staff people told him. Even if it had been poor white workers, King would have done the same thing," he recalled. That's just the kind of person he was. But on April 3rd, King was in a crisis. He had given a rousing and powerful speech at a mass rally for striking workers in Memphis on March 18th, and vowed to come back to lead a mass march and a general strike of workers, students, and teachers. When he returned on March 28th, everything went wrong. King had tried to lead a solidarity march, but black teenagers and possibly agents provocateurs broke out store windows after a Black Power lumpen proletariat group called the Invaders had egged them on. Its leader, Charles Cabbage, told me his group deliberately set out to discredit King's nonviolent strategy through disruptive street actions. Black ministers led King out of the march, while James Lawson tried to halt it. Police officers charged, beating everyone in sight and sending many marchers to the hospital. It was a brutal police riot as much as anything, but mass media news stories depicted King as an instigator and a coward running from the melee. Hostile congressmen and news outlets charged that King could not mount a nonviolent march in Washington, D.C. King had seen Memphis as a natural starting place for his Poor People's Campaign, in which African Americans, Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, Native Americans, and poor and working-class whites would besiege Congress to demand acceptable standards of housing, health care, education, and meaningful employment. Economic justice for all. The richest country in the world, he said, had the means to end poverty. It only lacked the will to do so. Memphis put all that in jeopardy. King felt he had to return to lead a nonviolent mass march, or an image of movement disunity around nonviolent tactics would destroy his credibility to launch the Poor People's Campaign. In this emotionally charged atmosphere, King called on his audience at Mason Temple to stay together and maintain unity, to not fall prey to what the Pharaoh had done during slavery. He kept the slaves fighting among themselves, he said, but when the slaves get together, that's the beginning of getting out of slavery. In his last days, King spoke repeatedly about the legacy of slavery and the need to overturn it through solidarity. King insisted, "We've got to march again, in order to put the issue where it is supposed to be, that there are 1,300 of God's children here suffering, sometimes going hungry, going through dark and dreary nights, wondering how this thing is going to come out. That's the issue." King's return to Memphis was a faith act, buffeted by opposition from outside and inside the freedom movement. King refused to back off. Often on the road for 300 days a year, he declared, "The preacher must have a kind of fire shut up in his bones, and whenever injustice is around, he must tell it." King still had the fire. In this extemporaneous speech, King drew on the seemingly impossible victories of the past for strength. The student sit-ins and freedom rides of the early 1960s, black children standing up to fire hoses and police dogs in Birmingham, Alabama, civil rights and labor mobilizations that successfully pressured Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964, guaranteeing equal access to the law, to public facilities, and to jobs. The sacrifice of lives in Mississippi and in Alabama to obtain the Federal Voting Rights Act of 1965. People often called the civil and voting rights campaigns from 1955 to 1965 the Second Reconstruction, an effort to bring back the rights crushed by violence after slave emancipation and Reconstruction following the Civil War. But King now sought yet another phase of struggle, beyond civil and voting rights, for economic justice. In these powerful days, he said, an interracial coalition could make America what it ought to be. In King's last speech, he reminded his audience of the collective power they had as consumers and workers. If employers and politicians would not do right by the sanitation workers, he warned them, "We do have an agenda that we must follow, and our agenda calls for withdrawing economic support from you." A boycott of Memphis downtown businesses and of the commercial appeal newspaper that had distorted the issues and misled much of the white community had already proved the power of economic withdrawal, a tried and true method of labor and civil rights movements. In making his appeal for solidarity, King relied on black Southern familiarity with the gospel of Jesus and his role as a prophet demanding economic justice. God had commanded us to be concerned about the slums down here, and his children can't eat 3 square meals a day, King said. He drew on the Good Samaritan parable told by Jesus to his disciples to drive home his point. He painted a word picture of the desolate, curving, dangerous road between Jerusalem and Jericho, and told the story of the Samaritan who stopped to help a man of a different race who had been beaten, robbed, and left for dead. The wealthy and religious Levites had passed him by, but the lowly Good Samaritan risked his safety to save another man's life. Virtually all of the people in Mason Temple that night knew this story and its meaning. King's last speech was part of a biblical epic that they heard from the pulpit and sang about almost weekly. King's lesson was, let us develop a kind of dangerous unselfishness. He thought the parallel to Memphis was obvious. The question is not, if I stop to help this man in need, what will happen to me? Rather, if I do not stop to help the sanitation workers, what will happen to them? That is the question. Going down the Jericho road, King had said many times, required dangerous altruism, being willing to sacrifice for others. That belief remained at the core of his religion and his life. True to form, as King neared the end of his speech, he became as one with an electrified and uplifted audience. Against the powerful winds and crackling lightning outside, people shouted, "Tell it! Go ahead on!" and rose from their seats. King took them beyond the petty tyrannies they lived with day in and day out. Ministers attacked by police, strikers whose children were hungry, students who had walked out of school. They all shared a vision of more noble human relationships. People may be poor, they may be tired, King told them, but whenever men and women straighten their backs up, they're going somewhere, because a man can't ride your back unless it is bent. King then turned to his premonitions of death. He recalled the mentally ill black woman who stabbed him through the chest with a letter opener in 1958. That dagger lodged against his aorta and would have killed him if he had merely sneezed. He gave thanks that he did not sneeze, so that he could be a part of the great changes brought about by the freedom movement. Starting with the bombing of his home in Montgomery in 1956, King had counted his days as numbered. When an assassin murdered President John F. Kennedy with a rifle bullet on November 22, 1963, King had told his wife Coretta that this is how he too would die. King recounted that when he and his aides got on the plane in Atlanta that morning, the pilot said over the public address system, "We're sorry for the delay, but we have Dr. Martin Luther King on the plane. And to be sure that all of the bags were checked, and to be sure that nothing would be wrong with on the plane, we had to check out everything carefully, and we've had the plane protected and guarded all night." King was a toxic figure to racists and the extreme right, to the FBI, and to the police and many white public officials. The commander of the Memphis police publicly warned that King could be killed if he returned to Memphis. King said, And then I got into Memphis, and some began to say the threats or talk about the threats that were out. What would happen to me from some of our sick white brothers? Well, I don't know what will happen now. King's voice trembling, he asserted, "We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop." From his parable of the Good Samaritan on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, King had moved to the image of Moses leading the oppressed Hebrew slaves out of Egypt, looking out from Mount Pisgah across to Jericho and seeing Canaan, the land the Lord promised as a land of freedom for the Jews. Black preachers for generations had used the Exodus as a story of hope for liberation from slavery. King's audience knew the story well. They also knew that according to Scripture, after he saw the promised land, Moses died. Raising his voice, King concluded, "I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land." He shouted out a verse from the battle hymn of the Republic, an anthem written to end slavery. "Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." King turned, almost in a trance, and nearly collapsed into the arms of Ralph Abernathy, surrounded by James Lawson and his other colleagues. Pandemonium swept Mason Temple. King's last speech came at a hard-won moment of spiritual triumph. He had frequently said, "I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place." But King spoke of something more valuable than life itself. People with a common history of slavery, barbaric lynching, daily oppression in public places, police brutality, incarceration, poverty and labor exploitation, employer and white worker discrimination, the unimaginable humiliation of black women raped with no consequences for the rapist. Yes, these people could quickly understand this moment. In Mason Temple, a community deeply wronged by injustice called upon its collective resources and sense of solidarity. This is what the movement was all about, creating hope out of despair, taking action instead of giving in to fear, finding joy and speaking of love rather than succumbing to hatred. While some recalled the foreboding of King's last speech, Reverend James Lawson, who had brought King to Memphis, remembered the uplifting power of King's speech that night. He took it not as a sign of darkness to come, but as a ray of light breaking through the clouds, a promise of freedom that inspired them all. Some who were there also felt a deadly chill mixed with King's ecstatic prophecy. Clarence Coe, a black member of the United Rubber Workers Union, whose union hall provided the launch pad for strike activities, commented, "I mean, if you listen to King's last speech, he could see it. But he had just gone to the point that he couldn't turn around, and he knew it was going to happen. He knew it was going to happen." Despite concern for King's life, Coe felt King's message of hope. In contrast to his "I Have a Dream" speech in 1963, witnessed by over 200,000 people at the Lincoln Memorial and broadcast live across the nation, King's Promised Land speech came at an almost private moment, among a small, beleaguered group of people and a community in turmoil. It burned deeply into the consciousness of those present, solidifying resolve and strength to move forward. This moment displayed King's prophetic role in building alliances and solidarity. Because of Memphis, he would be remembered not only as a civil rights icon, but also as a labor hero. With a Bible in one hand and the Constitution and Bill of Rights in the other, King had played a key role in the struggle for freedom and economic justice for 13 years. He was 39 years old. He would be assassinated the next day. More than 50 years since Memphis, how should we remember King? People know of him as a civil rights advocate, but do they know about his lifelong struggle for economic justice and the empowerment of poor and working-class people of all colors? How we remember King matters. It helps us to see where we have been and to understand.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?